In January 1975, a primary school teacher in Wolverhampton struck a 9-year-old boy across the palm with a leather strap for arriving late 3 days in a row. The headmaster signed off on it. The boy's parents were informed. Nobody lost their job. Nobody filed a complaint. That single detail tells you everything you need to know about the distance between the school Britain ran in 1975 and the one it runs today. The classrooms, the rules, the rituals, the punishments, the food, the silences, a world apart. And most of it has vanished without a formal announcement, without a ceremony, without a single national conversation about what was lost alongside what was rightly discarded. These are 15 things British schools did in 1975 that would end careers, trigger investigations, or make national headlines today. This is file number 14 of the Forgotten Britain archive. Number 15. The morning assembly prayer was not optional. Every state school in England and Wales was legally required, under the 1944 Education Act, to begin each day with a collective act of worship. This was not a gentle suggestion. It was statute. Head teachers who ignored it faced formal censure. The prayer was Christian in character. The hymns were drawn from a standard rotating list, and every child, regardless of their family's faith, stood in the hall and participated. In Birmingham, Bradford, and Brick Lane, where significant Muslim and Sikh communities had been established since the late 1950s, children whose families had never set foot inside a Church of England building stood and recited the Lord's Prayer every morning. A complaint to the local education authority would have been received with polite indifference. The Act was not amended in any meaningful way until 1988, and even then it was softened rather than abolished. Today, schools with diverse catchments treat compulsory Christian worship as what it always was, an imposition. Any head teacher who enforced it rigidly in a multi-faith school would find a solicitor's letter on their desk within the week. Number 14. Teachers kept a cane in the desk drawer and used it. By 1975, the cane was standard issue in the majority of British secondary schools and in a significant proportion of primaries. The Plowden Report of 1967 had recommended its abolition, but recommendations are not laws. Local education authorities varied wildly in their approach. In some London boroughs, the strap had already been retired. In most of England's industrial north and in Wales, it remained in active daily use. The procedure was often formalised. A punishment book, a record of strokes administered, a requirement for a second teacher to witness. That formalisation was presented as a safeguard. It was, in practice, simply bureaucracy applied to pain. Britain did not ban corporal punishment in state schools until 1986, 11 years after this particular classroom year. Independent schools kept it legal until 1998. Any teacher who struck a child today would be arrested before the end of the school day. Number 13. School dinners were cooked from raw ingredients on the premises every single day. This one sits differently from the others. In 1975, the majority of British state schools operated their own kitchens, staffed by dinner ladies who arrived before 7 in the morning and cooked everything from scratch: mince and dumplings, spotted dick with custard, proper suet pastry. The budget was extraordinarily tight. The government allocation per meal in 1975 was approximately 12 pence, the equivalent of roughly £1.60 today, which made the quality of what those women produced close to miraculous. The shift away from in-house cooking accelerated through the 1980s as local authorities contracted out catering to save money. By the mid-1990s, kitchens were being ripped out of schools across the country. The skill, the infrastructure, the institutional knowledge of how to feed 400 children a hot meal from raw produce, all of it quietly dismantled. Today, the career that would end is not a teacher's. It is a politician's, if they suggested defunding school meal provision in the way that happened under compulsion throughout the Thatcher years. Number 12. Children were seated and ranked by academic performance in front of the entire class. In most British classrooms in 1975, streaming was not merely an administrative tool applied at school level. It operated inside the individual classroom, visibly and without apology. The brightest children sat at the front. The slowest sat at the back. In many schools, End-of-term examinations produced a ranked order that was read aloud. Position 1 down to position 34. The child who came last heard their name called last, in front of their peers, every single term. No pastoral consideration, no differentiated feedback, no quiet conversation with a parent about learning difficulties. The premise was that competition sharpened effort, and that public humiliation of failure was an acceptable mechanism for motivating improvement. Educational psychology had already begun arguing otherwise. The schools largely ignored it. Today, any teacher who read ranked examination results aloud in a classroom would face a formal complaint before the parents' evening. If that tells you something about how far attitudes to childhood have shifted, what comes next tells you something far more specific about what was happening inside those buildings that nobody spoke about at all. Number 11. Unqualified adults supervise children in total isolation with no oversight whatsoever. The caretaker, the dinner lady, the parent helper. In 1975, none of these people had undergone any form of background check. The disclosure and barring service did not exist. Its predecessor, the List 99 Register of Individuals barred from working with children, was poorly maintained and almost never consulted for non-teaching staff. An adult could walk into a British school in 1975, volunteer to hear reading in a back room, and nobody would know anything about them beyond their name and which street they lived on. The inquiry into historical child abuse in institutions, which began formally in 2015 and continued for years, documented in exhaustive detail what that absence of screening made possible. The careers that ended as a result of that inquiry ended decades late. Number 10. Schools openly administered corporal punishment from parents who could not be present to do it themselves. There existed in British schools throughout the 1970s a practice known informally as the delegated caning. A parent, unwilling or unable to discipline a child at home, could submit a written request to the head teacher asking that punishment be administered on their behalf. The school, in accepting this request, became a proxy instrument of parental discipline. It was legal. It was not unusual. A head teacher in a Staffordshire comprehensive recalled signing 14 such delegated requests in the academic year 1974 to 1975. The state, the family, and the institution operated as a single disciplinary unit with the child at the centre and no independent voice speaking on the child's behalf. Today, this arrangement would constitute, at minimum, a safeguarding failure of the most serious category. Number 9. Teachers smoked in classrooms, staff rooms, and school corridors. The staff room in a British secondary school in 1975 was thick with cigarette smoke before morning registration. Many authorities permitted smoking in staff rooms as a matter of course. In some schools, particularly at secondary level, teachers smoked in corridors between lessons. At dinner time, a member of staff patrolling the playground might do so with a cigarette in hand. The head teacher might smoke in their office while conducting a meeting with a pupil. No policy existed to protect the children from the secondary exposure because no institutional will existed to acknowledge that the exposure was harmful. The connection between passive smoking and respiratory illness was scientifically established during this period, but the cultural lag between knowledge and practice was, as always, enormous. Any teacher lighting a cigarette inside a school building today would be dismissed. Number 8. Physical education lessons included exercises that are now classified as dangerous and developmentally inappropriate. The wall bars, the vaulting box, the ropes hanging from gymnasium ceilings to a height of 20 feet with no crash mat below. The beam walked by 11-year-olds with no spotting technique applied by the supervising teacher. In 1975, British school PE was inherited almost directly from the Swedish gymnastics tradition of the late 19th century, updated very little in the intervening 80 years. The assumption was that children were physically resilient and that falls were educationally instructive. A child who fell from a rope and broke their wrist was expected to be more careful the following week. There was no risk assessment. There was no formal framework for equipment safety inspection. There was a teacher with a whistle and a shed full of apparatus that had not been safety tested since its installation. The Health and Safety at Work Act was only passed in 1974, and its implications for school PE equipment took years to filter through. Today, The liability alone would close a school. Number 7. Children with learning differences were placed in separate units and given no defined curriculum. By 1975, the language used to describe children with dyslexia, dyscalculia, or what would today be identified as autism spectrum conditions was, to put it charitably, imprecise. Remedial class, slow learner. The bottom stream. In many schools, a child identified as academically below standard, for whatever reason, was removed from mainstream lessons and placed in a separate classroom with a different teacher and a curriculum that was effectively improvised. There was no statutory requirement to identify specific learning difficulties. There was no educational psychologist visit as a matter of course. There was a teacher doing their best with no training, no diagnosis, and no framework. The Education Act of 1981, passed 6 years after this particular school year, introduced the statement of special educational needs for the first time. Before it, a child who struggled was overwhelmingly likely to leave school at 16 without anyone having understood why. Number 6. School buildings were unheated to a degree that today would trigger an environmental health inspection. The average temperature inside a British school classroom in the winter of 1975 was monitored, at best, inconsistently. The government minimum requirement was 60 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 15 degrees Celsius, a threshold so modest it would barely be considered habitable. In practice, many older Victorian school buildings, of which there were thousands still in use, struggled to meet even that minimum. Children sat in coats in classrooms in January. Teachers conducted lessons in scarves. The caretaker managed a coal or oil boiler that might be perfectly functional or might be one cold snap away from failure. The big freeze of February 1963 had already demonstrated what British schools did when temperatures became genuinely dangerous. They stayed open. Closing a school for cold was seen as weakness. Today, a school recording indoor temperatures below 16 degrees Celsius during occupied hours faces immediate closure under workplace health regulations. Number 5. Children as young as 7 were sent on unsupervised errands off school premises. The milk monitor. The dinner register runner. The child dispatched to the local newsagent to collect the morning papers for the staff room. In 1975, it was entirely normal for a primary school to send a child of 7 or 8 years old off the school premises, alone, to perform an administrative task. The task was understood as a privilege, a mark of responsibility, a small but meaningful piece of the education. The logic was not without its own coherence. Trust builds character, responsibility builds competence. The child who ran the errand was proud to have been chosen, but the safeguarding calculation that any school would apply today, that a child sent alone off premises is an unacceptable liability, simply did not exist in the risk language of 1975. Any teacher who sent a 7-year-old to a local shop unaccompanied today would face a formal investigation. Number 4. School medical inspections were conducted in open spaces without any expectation of privacy. The school nurse in 1975 was a figure of both authority and mild terror. The annual or biannual medical inspection, which might include height, weight, hearing, vision, and a general physical assessment, was in many schools conducted in conditions that offered the child almost no privacy. Screenings took place in school halls, in corridors partitioned by curtains, in rooms where other children might be present. The knit nurse, a fixture of the era, checked children's hair in the classroom itself, in front of their peers. To be found with head lice was a matter of public record within the class by the end of the morning. The medical record was kept in a manila folder that circulated between teachers without any formal confidentiality framework. Today, the information governance requirements alone around a child's medical data would make the 1975 arrangement illegal under several pieces of legislation simultaneously. Number 3. Teachers regularly made contact with children in ways that would now require safeguarding referrals. This is the entry that requires the most care, because the truth inside it is more complex than a simple accusation. In 1975, a teacher who ruffled a child's hair, put a hand on a shoulder, or picked up a fallen infant without thinking twice, was not doing anything that their head teacher, their colleagues, or the child's parents would have considered remarkable. Physical contact between teachers and children existed in a completely different cultural and legal context. The problem is not, and never was, the hair ruffle. The problem is that the absence of any boundary, the total absence of any framework that distinguished between affectionate and inappropriate contact, created an environment in which the latter could occur and be systematically misread as the former. The inquiries that began in the 2010s and ran through the following decade made exactly this case. In institutional after institutional setting, the career that ends today for making contact without thinking is, in most cases, not ending for the hair ruffle. It is ending for the pattern behind it, that the 1,975 school was structurally unable to see. Number 2. Children were routinely left without supervision for extended periods with no accountability mechanism in place. There are 2 places in a British secondary school in 1975 where a child could be entirely alone and entirely invisible to any adult: the school library and the changing room after PE. The library functioned in many schools as an unofficial holding area. Children sent there during free periods or cover lessons were supervised by nobody. The changing rooms after a games lesson could empty before a teacher arrived, or the teacher might not arrive at all. The cover teacher system, where a member of staff took a class at short notice when a colleague was absent, existed but was applied inconsistently. A child could, on a given day in 1975, pass through the school gates at 9 in the morning and have meaningful adult contact for perhaps 40 minutes of the day. The rest was managed, or not managed, by circumstance. Today, safeguarding frameworks require line-of-sight supervision as a baseline in virtually every school context. The gap between then and now is not merely administrative. It is a fundamentally different theory of what a school is for. And the first entry, the one that sat beneath all 15 of these practices as their shared foundation, is this. Number 1. The authority of the teacher was legally and culturally beyond challenge, and the child had no formal recourse of any kind. In 1975, a British child who was treated unjustly by a teacher had, in practical terms, no avenue of appeal that carried any weight. The parent could speak to the head teacher. The head teacher would almost invariably support the teacher. The local education authority could be contacted in writing, but this was an act of considerable social bravery for a working-class family who depended on the goodwill of the school for a child's entire educational journey. The child's own account of events was considered less credible than the adult's by default. There was no governor complaint procedure that carried teeth. There was no independent ombudsman. There was no children's rights framework in domestic law. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child would not be drafted until 1989 and not ratified by the United Kingdom until 1991. In 1975, the school was sovereign over the child, and the child knew it. That imbalance enabled almost every other entry on this list. If you were in a British school in the 1970s, you know which of these you remember most clearly. The cold, the cane, the dinner hall with its particular noise, the nurse checking your hair in front of everyone. Leave a note below. Every account you share is part of the archive. These experiences deserve a permanent record, and this is where they belong. This was file number 14 of the Forgotten Britain archive. The classrooms of 1,975 were shaped by a Britain that had not yet decided what children were owed. The journey from that school to this one is a half-century of argument, injury, and hard-won reform. Not all of it was improvement, but most of it was necessary. There are 99 more files in the archive. Subscribe and turn the page with us.